All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are unpacking a really fascinating set of sources on one of the biggest voices in finance and macroeconomics, Ray Dalio.
hmm And it's followed the financial world at all. You know Dalio is. He's sort of packaged as the forecaster.
The guy with the crystal ball.
Exactly. He's the person who tells you what's next for interest rates, for inflation, for the U.S. and China. Everyone just wants the conclusion, right? What's going to happen?
And that search for the simple, the straight line prediction, that's exactly what our sources are saying is the biggest misunderstanding of his entire work.
It is. If you just treat him like a weather report for the next quarter, you're missing the entire foundation, the whole structure of his thinking.
So what's the real story then?
Well, the sources point to this deep conceptual tension. His public statements, what he says about portfolios or the dollar, they're delivered in this very clean, linear language.
Like if A happens,
Then B will follow.
exactly. But his entire analysis, the whole thing, rests on a premise that the world is just fundamentally messy and non-linear.
So he's speaking in straight lines about a world that moves in, what, loops and spirals?
Yes.
That's a contradiction we have to crack open.
And that's our mission for this deep dive. We're not here to say if his predictions are right or wrong. I mean, that's almost irrelevant.
Yeah.
We're here to understand his observational premise. What does he assume about the world that lets him speak that way? Because he isn't predicting something new. He's reading recurring structural patterns.
Okay, let's unpack that, this structural reading. What does he actually focus on that shows this cyclical nature you're talking about?
So the sources lay out these four massive forces. They aren't just one-off events. Think of them more like slow-moving tides that always circulate.
Give us the big four. Okay, so first there's the pattern of history itself. He looks at history like a playbook. Similar conditions, usually related to some kind of excess, lead to similar outcomes. The names change, but the script is kind of the same.
On the second.
The debt cycles. This is absolutely fundamental to his work. How economies grow and then inevitably collapse under their own weight. He doesn't see it as a one-time crisis. It's a necessary cycle, a purging process.
So you have history and debt as the big mechanical factors.
Right.
What about the people in the system?
Right. That brings us to the next two, which are more political, more sociological. Number three is internal conflict.
Driven by wealth gaps, that kind of thing.
Yeah, wealth and opportunity gaps inside a country.
Yeah.
That also seems to recur in predictable stages. You go from prosperity to rising tension to some kind of major challenge or realignment.
And the last one is the big one he's been talking about lately.
It is. The fourth is the shifts in global hegemony. The long, slow patterns of how great powers rise and then eventually decline.
So if I'm hearing you right, these four, history, debt, conflict, and hegemony, he's basically saying the world is made of these huge interconnected clocks. And the analyst's job is just to figure out where the hands are pointing.
That's a really good way of putting it. And what's crucial is how they interact. He doesn't see it as a simple chain, like the debt cycle causes a war.
It's not A, then B, then C.
No, it's a structure of circulation. It's more like a complex ecosystem. You don't say the soil causes the season to change. The soil, the air, the water, they all shift together, and the season always comes back, even if one day is a bit warmer or colder than last year.
That structural view sounds very abstract, almost philosophical. But the sources insist it's a practical adaptation. Why is that distinction so important?
Because if you're actually managing money or making policy, you need practical tools. Linear models, the ones that say if we do X, we get Y employment, they're just not working as well anymore. The world is too connected.
The old map is broken.
The old map is broken. And when that happens, looking for these big recurring structures isn't philosophy. It's the only reliable way to navigate.
Okay, that makes sense. But this brings us right back to the central puzzle. If his view of reality is so complex and cyclical, why does he present it in such clear, almost simplistic, linear language?
That's the core of it, really. And the sources argue that this choice is completely intentional. It's a practical decision designed for very specific, high-stakes environments.
And which environments are those?
There are places where a decision has to be made. Right now, so you're talking about markets, where you have to buy or sell.
No time for a philosophical debate.
None. You're talking about policy decisions, which need clear steps. And, of course, investment judgments when you're under pressure. You can't tell a government or a client, well, it's all irreducibly complex. That's paralyzing. That's analysis paralysis.
So the simple advice, the linear do this, is a kind of a practical interface. It's a way for people to actually use the information to do something.
Exactly. It's a user manual for an incredibly chaotic machine. But underneath that simple user manual, you find the nonlinear assumptions that make it work in the first place.
And what are those assumptions? You said there were a few key conditions.
Yeah, three critical ones that linear models tend to ignore. The first is simultaneous factors. A linear model says A causes B. Dalio's world assumes A, B, C, and D are all happening at once and messing with each other.
So when he says the US dollar will weaken.
Right. That's the simple linear claim. But it's supported by the simultaneous push and pull of U.S. debt, geopolitical moves in Asia, and our own political polarization at home. It's never just one thing.
Okay, I can get my head around that. What's the next one?
The second is a bit tougher, but it's crucial. Discrepancies in the time axis.
Meaning things are moving at different speeds.
Wildly different speeds. A debt cycle might be a slow-moving freight train that takes 15 years to play out. But a tech shift, like AI, is a jet plane changing reality in maybe 3 years. They're on the same track, but they are not on the same clock.
So he's watching a jet plane and a freight train on a collision course, but he has to explain it in a soundbite.
That's the challenge, yeah. And the third condition is constant interference between internal and external factors. A decision made in Washington can be instantly canceled out or amplified by a sovereign wealth fund in Riyadh or a supply chain shift in Vietnam. The inside and the outside are constantly bleeding into each other.
You know, I have to push back a little here. If he knows all this complexity is there at different speeds, constant interference, isn't simplifying it down to the dollar will weaken a bit misleading?
That's a fair question, but the sources frame it not as a compromise of rigor, but a compromise for utility. He's not denying the complexity. He's compressing it into a language for people who are forced to act. The point is, he doesn't talk about nonlinearity, but his claims only make sense if you assume it's the bedrock condition of the world.
Okay, so let's shift from his words to the world itself. The sources also suggest that his analysis is so persuasive because reality has already changed to fit his description.
Exactly. The power of his argument isn't some new theory. It's that he's describing a world we already feel. For most of history, you could often boil things down to a single cause, a single timeline, and a single main actor. The king, the central bank.
And now?
Now that's all gone.
Yeah.
We're driven by thousands of intersecting causes, moving at different speeds, influenced by algorithms and global actors we can't even name. So Dalio's language is really just a label. He's naming the new weather system after the climate has already changed.
He's not the prophet, he's the reporter.
He's a reporter. Nonlinearity is the baseline condition, not some new idea he's pushing.
Which brings us to a really interesting idea in the source material, the concept of silence. What does he intentionally not talk about? What's the boundary of his framework?
This is fascinating. The sources point out 3 domains that are placed just outside his direct claims, and they're much more personal, more philosophical.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is the transformation of the subject, meaning the actors themselves are changing. He measures these grand cycles as if the entities inside them, the nation, the investor, are constant. But what if our very ability to think, or the idea of a nation-state itself, is fundamentally transforming during the cycle?
So he's measuring the tide, but not the changing chemistry of the water.
Perfect analogy. The second silence is the speed at which cognition is updated. Everything moves so fast now, markets, news, tech. But our brains, our ability to process it all, move much, much slower. He analyzes the macro changes, but he leaves aside the problem of how we humans can even keep up.
And the third silence.
The third is maybe the biggest challenge for any observer. The problem of the observer being included in the system.
The act of observing changes the thing being observed.
Yes. When a massive investor like Dalio says this is happening, that statement immediately enters the system and becomes a new factor that influences the outcome. He's part of the weather system he's reporting on.
So he draws a clear line. I'll analyze the external system, but I won't get into how my analysis changes it or how fast people can understand it. That silence is what allows him to be practical.
It is, and that's why any other framework is just an auxiliary instrument. It's not there to prove him wrong. It's a tool to help us see the line between the verbalized claim and the silent premise.
So after this whole deep dive, we've basically landed on the idea that the biggest insight isn't what he predicts, but how he translates a messy, nonlinear world into actionable, linear advice.
And that messy world is already here. It's the baseline condition of our century.
Which brings us to the final question. What does this mean for you, the listener? You hear these economic narratives every single day. If we accept this premise that the clearest advice rests on a complex, unspoken reality, how should that change the way we listen?
It means we have to listen for the structure underneath the conclusion. When someone gives you a clean prediction, A will cause B, your first question should be, okay, but what about C, D, and E? And are A and B even on the same clock? We have to stop demanding simple cause and effect.
So we become smarter consumers of information. We stop looking for prophecies and start looking for these recurring patterns. We realize that clarity is often just compressed complexity.
And we have to remember that the clearer and more confident the claim, the larger the unspoken iceberg of assumptions is hiding underneath.
So a few thoughts to leave you with. What assumptions are hiding beneath the most trusted economic narratives you hear every day? The ones that sound the most simple and actionable.
And what becomes visible to you when you stop demanding simple, linear explanations for huge global events? What patterns start to emerge that maybe you dismissed before as just coincidence?
And finally, ask yourself, are you already using this kind of nonlinear observation in your own life, in your career, in your community? Maybe we all recognize these recurring structures long before the experts give them a name, something to think about until our next deep dive.